Of course.
We want to make sure you were in before we let the rest of the students here. So Joe has been, he's a gap year Cornell student that you've not met yet, and he's been helping with the Xoogler School program, this 8-week program. And as you know, Rosie and Alina are our students. So
Hey, good to see you guys.
yeah.
Hey.
So
Kat, I'm gonna make you a co-host so that you can share your screen.
Cool.
Unless, do you have a presentation that you're gonna share or not?
I don't. I could, but I
No worries.
There's a Q&A session that we're running.
Well, you're still a co-host anyway.
Cool.
Well, why don't I get started, as I know a few people are going to start rolling in. And for those who are able to put their cameras on, please do. It's always good to have the reactions and seeing all of you, and as Kat is speaking, to make sure she continues on a certain down the line track, or as you know, communication is all about visual as well. It's so hard these days to figure this out with only doing Zoom, unfortunately. But first of all, Kat, thank you so much for spending time with the Xoogler School students. As you know, we a bunch of 60 students with having a gap year. So a couple of them have graduated already, but a lot of them are entrepreneurs were excited to join the Xoogler School because they are hoping to start a company. And to give you some background, for those who are unaware of Y Combinator, if any of you are thinking about doing a startup, please consider looking at the website and applying. She'll probably talk to you about the different programs that Y Combinator offers, but I got closer to YC when I did a class under them called the Y Combinator Startup School for Investors. And the current president was the instructor and the person that coordinated all the speakers. And a lot of inspiration I got for putting together Xoogler School was from Jeff Ralston's class. And with his leadership as well, he was able to connect me with Kat as we were trying to encourage more female Xoogler founders to apply for YC. So thank you, Kat, for all your help already.
Of course.
But without further ado, I'll pass it over to Rosie and Alina, who have kindly agreed to co-moderate this session with me. Thank you, Rosie and Alina.
So I just wanted to say thank you to Chris and Joe for this opportunity to be able to moderate this discussion today, and a big special thank you to Kat for being here and just helping us explore the world of startups and YC. So just to get into it, could you give us a little bit of a background about what your career journey has been like?
Yeah, sure. So I graduated from Northwestern University in 2007, and my background was in journalism and film, actually. But while I was at Northwestern, I also did a lot of work with the Internet and Society kind of department. It was like a mix of tech and sociology, because I'm from the Bay Area, from San Francisco, and have always been exposed to sort of tech from a young age, and I loved gaming, and what we really looked at was the intersection of technology and culture, which always was super interesting to me. So I actually worked at Wired magazine for 4 years right after school, and I thought that was such a cool place to be, because you got to sort of see like what was coming next, and what was what were people excited about on the tech and culture side of things. And while I was there, I Reddit, which was in the very first batch of Y Combinator, it had been recently acquired by Condé Nast, which is the parent company of Wired. So they were in our office, and I got to know those founders, Alexis Ohanian and Steve Huffman. And back then, Reddit was only about 5 people. Like, only 5 people worked at Reddit. So I'd eat lunch with them every day. And after being at Wired for 4 years, I asked Alexis, I said, what do you think I should do next? And if you start to meet more startup founders, you realize they become startup pushers. Like, they're just like startup enthusiasts. So he told me, you should start your own company. Like, you should apply to YC. And then he was like, wait, okay, if you don't have an idea yet, you should work at a startup. And so he started introducing me to all of these startup founders who were YC alumni. I started interviewing, and then midway through that process, Alexis said, hey, I'm actually starting my own fund, a nonprofit. Would you just like to join me as my, we can make up a title for you as my chief of staff, or head of ops or whatever. And Alexis and I were good friends at that point, and I thought I would learn so much from him. So I worked with Alexis for 2 years. And I worked on, he had a fund back then, it was just an angel fund called Capital Capital. That was before he started Initialize, which is his bigger fund, which is still around now. And he had a nonprofit called Bread Pig. And so we ran those two things, and kind of just picked and chose like what projects to work on. But from Alexis, I learned, I think he's one of the best online community builders in the world. Reddit is now like one of the top 5 to 10 sites in the US. So I learned a lot about how to build community online. And then from working with all his portfolio companies, I learned a lot about how to support very early stage companies as they launched, as they grew. And so I got a really great sort of hands-on experience working with startups with Alexis. And then, so I'd been in New York at that point for about 2.5 years. And then I moved back to San Francisco. And I accidentally worked at Samsung for 6 months. And I say accidentally because so they pitched us on this big, like, my friend was there and he was like, we are launching this iTunes of Android. It's going to be huge. And, when I got to Samsung, I realized like I wasn't used to working. Samsung is great hardware, right? Good hardware. But I think the software process, is, especially at that time, this was maybe like 2012, 2013, it was very slow moving. So in order to get anything changed, anything done, it took like months and months and months. And it was so much slower than working with startups and working in a sort of like small, like well-run, tight-knit organization. So I, after 6 months of being there, I was like, I don't think this is for me. And Alexis calls me up again and says, hey, Jessica Livingston and Paul Graham are looking for their first director of outreach at YC, and you should talk to them. And I was like, I don't know. I've only been here 6 months. I'm going to thug it out. I'm going to like really just try to like make something work. And he was like, no, you're talking to them tomorrow. I set up a meeting. And I went to, their office, and I started talking to Paul and Jessica, and their initial sort of vision for that role. And back then YC was maybe only maximum 10 people who were working at the organization. They'd said, the typical person that applies to YC is, they probably know about YC through Hacker News. So they were like, it's probably like 85-90% male, and it's it's all from like a certain demographic. They're like, if we had one person thinking about where do you find smart, hardworking people around the country, around the world, and who haven't heard about YC, or maybe haven't even thought about starting a startup as an option, they're like, if we just even have one person working on that, like, what could we have? And they were like, you could be our growth team of one. So I loved sort of their vision for what they wanted to do with YC. And back then they were probably funding about 50 to 75 companies a batch. And then in the past 7 years, now we're funding about 250 companies a batch. We've become very international. Like the range of types of companies that we fund has broadened as well, and the founders as well. And so that's a big piece of what I get to work on at YC. And then a year later, I became a full-time partner. And what that means is all the kind of partners and execs at YC, we read applications. So we get about 15,000 applications every 6 months. And so we read those applications, we interview companies, we fund them, and then we work alongside them as they grow. And I specifically focus on helping companies with their pitches and their initial launches. So teaching companies how to sort of succinctly and clearly explain what they do to anyone in a way that will compel people to use them, to try them out, to invest. And then anytime you see a company in TechCrunch, they probably, a YC company, they probably talk to me first. And then, so that's about 50% of my job, and 50% is still on the outreach side. So everything we do externally to encourage more people from around the world to apply and to start companies. So that's a quick background.
Yeah, that's really incredible. And a really interesting journey that you've taken, especially because I think, like as a woman who maybe one day wants to start a startup, it's really awesome to have people that are really encouraging that. So, I guess kind of jumping off of that, what kind of work do you do as the director of outreach? Like, how do you go about really encouraging more people to become founders and start startups?
Yeah. So when I started, YC's sort of what we did externally was super, super limited. Like maybe we would speak at like 2 or 3 schools a year. We did one event a year called Startup School, but back then it was just a 1 day event where we had speakers, past alum, and heads of tech companies speak about their early stage experience. But these days, I think we probably we're at hundreds of universities every year talking to people about, what YC is and some of the myths around starting companies and how to get started and what to focus on while you're still in school. We do a lot more work with our alumni, kind of helping them tell their own stories, because I think our best sort of spokespeople are our alumni. And we funded, now I think we're a community of 5,000 founders, and so working with them to help them better spread the word and encourage their networks to apply to YC and start startups. And so we have a lot of sort of alumni facing work that we do, a lot of university work. We work with a lot of international organizations as well. So international organizations that are promoting entrepreneurship or founders. And I also have the pleasure of running the Female Founders Conference. We just recently rebranded it to Future Founders Conference. But it's happening November 18th is the next one. And so I'll share the link in the chat. But we've been running this series for, I guess, 5 or 6 years now. And the goal is, to get more women to think about starting companies and to learn more about what they need to do at the very earliest stages if they're interested. And so that I think, it's wonderful that, I've loved, kind of creating that platform and working with a lot of women, a lot of alumni, and then a lot of other women founders to kind of create that community and to build that sort of, kind of, I guess, curriculum almost of that we share.
Yeah, awesome. So what are some of the best parts of working at Y Combinator? And I kind of have a feeling that might be part of it.
Yeah, so actually, one of my favorite parts of YC is reading applications. Because so at YC, we never purport to know what the next big idea is. Like we're never like, here's what's going to be the next big thing. Like nobody, like when Airbnb applied to YC and interviewed at YC, like everybody thought they were crazy. Like nobody thought that idea was going to go anywhere, but they loved the founders. And so I think reading applications, like in any given like application cycle, we're reading between like maybe 500 to 1,500 applications, and you get to kind of see into people's heads and see what some of the smartest, most creative people in the world are thinking about and the problems that they want to solve and the creative ways they're coming up with to tackle those problems. And so I think it's so much fun to kind of read those applications and to see into founders and future founders' heads. And then I get to do a lot of office hours with startups that are pre-YC, so sort of like people that are just thinking about applying or just getting started, and that's really fun too because you get to sort of dream alongside the founder, because at the beginning, like anything is possible. Like they could really take this like very simple sounding idea that sounds just like a toy at the beginning, and you can think about like help the founder think about, so what if hundreds or thousands or millions of people in the world had access to this technology? Like what's the most interesting thing that could come out of this? And so working with like really early stage teams and like it's super inspiring. So I think that's probably one of the things that I like best about YC.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I can imagine that would be really interesting. So now I'm going to transition to Alina, and she's going to ask you some more questions, kind of about YC and entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. It's been really cool till now. And I just wanted to jump off of that idea of reading applications and dreaming with the startups. So what are some of the best practices of filling out a YC application for some of the future founders here at Xoogler?
Yeah, so the biggest, I think the most important thing is to practice like clearly and concisely communicating what you do in a way that anyone can understand. And sometimes this is particularly hard for, we now have a lot of founders who are from, bio, life sciences, who are used to using a lot of technical jargon, or even people building deep tech startups. They use a lot of technical jargon because they're used to talking to their peers. The thing is, if but you need to kind of work on explaining what you do without any of that jargon, really stripping away what it is you do, and really just talking about like, here's the problem, here's how we're solving it, this is who we're building for. And it needs to be said in a way that anyone can understand, because you're not necessarily like, not everyone that you pitch, like not every investor, not every press person, not every person at YC is going to understand what you do from like a deep technical perspective. So I think it's important to very clearly and succinctly communicate what it is you do. And that's the first thing we ask, right? It's like, in one sentence, tell us what you're building. And so if we can't understand that first sentence, or the first like couple answers to the first couple questions, it's really hard to get past that. And what's funny is I used to think that this was very much of a pre-YC problem, right? Like a problem that startups and founders have in the very earliest stages. But recently, one of my colleagues, Janelle, she wrote this guide on, she helps hundreds of Series A companies raise, write their pitches, write their decks, and raise like millions of dollars. And she recently published this guide on Hacker News. And one of the top comments on Hacker News was, hey, I'm a Series A investor. And one of my biggest issues with people's pitches is I don't understand what they're doing. And if I can't understand in the first like minute what you're building, then I just completely shut off. And I'm like disinterested in what you're building, no matter how interesting the tech might be or how much of an impact it might have. So I think really getting past that moment of like, and really like practicing that short pitch with as many people as possible, both people in your industry and people who are not, is one of the things I can say is like an easy first step to filling out the YC app.
Yeah, that's really cool, because even here at Xoogler School, we're focused on that kind of idea of an elevator pitch, more specific to pitching yourself to future employers, but I believe it can apply to founders and startups as well. So jumping off of that point, once say someone has filled out the application and gotten into Y Combinator, what does Y Combinator do, and what does it offer to these founders?
Sure. So YC is a 3-month program. So typically what happens is you apply, and then we end up doing interviews with the top maybe 1,500 applicants or 1,500 teams that apply. It's a 10-minute interview. And if we want to fund you, we tell you that day if you're funded. And then pre-COVID, people had a couple months to sort of move to the Bay Area from wherever they were. And, all startups from around the world. And these days it's about 40% international. So they would move to the Bay Area for 3 to 6 months. And then during the YC program, we work really closely with the founders for that, kind of 3-month period. And we say like the only things that you should be doing are coding and talking to users. So really just focusing, we kind of provide a framework for focus. So a lot of the alumni who I talk to are like, this was the most highly leveraged, kind of time in my company's life. Like I got more done than I ever thought was possible. And we tell them to strip away, like don't do any investor meetings like during this time. Don't do any events. Like all you should be doing is building product, talking to users, and then iterating based on that user feedback. And so what happens, like we have a free like online school called Startup School, where we put a lot of this information online for free so you can access it. But what happens like at YC is it's really office hours. So you do maybe once a week you'll meet with you have 2 or 3 group partners that are dedicated to you who have built and scaled companies themselves. So you'll meet one-on-one with them. And then every 2 weeks, you meet with a group of about 10 other companies and your group partners, and they'll talk about what are the 2 things that you've achieved in the past 2 weeks, what are the 2 things you hope to achieve in the next 2 weeks, and then what are the main challenges you have. So often you'll get the best advice from group partners who've seen maybe 1,000 companies go through the program. So we can kind of like pattern match and say like, okay, like this is, another company in this space overcame that problem because, this way. but sometimes the best advice will come from fellow founders who are in the midst of building and maybe just solved that SEO issue, or that whatever issue you have. So as the batches get larger, there's always someone in the batch that can help you solve a problem. So it's a lot of kind of individualized office hours. And then at the very end of YC, so it is demo day. And at demo day, all of our companies just get 2 minutes to pitch, to pitch maybe a couple thousand investors. And so 10 days before demo day, we flip into fundraising mode, where we help you figure out what is the most compelling parts of your pitch that will get investors excited about joining your journey at this moment. And so we do something called vertebrae office hours. So we figure out, what does the backbone of your presentation look like? What are the 2 to 3 most interesting points that you can just like lodge into an investor's brain? Because when you're presenting among like 200 other companies and to a couple thousand investors, like if you get a random investor from the audience and you ask them like, hey, what did you remember about Boom Aerospace? They'll say something about supersonic jets, they got a $5 billion LOI. Like, they can only remember 2 like data points about you. So we really help companies like figure that out, and then they present it, and then basically our relationship with the company goes on into perpetuity. Like, we're still very close to Reddit, who was in the first batch of YC, as they've grown. Airbnb, and we still stay really close. And YC now has built, most of my partners are former YC alumni. And so we're building a lot of programs that they wish they'd had when they were first getting started. So like, we have something called Work at a Startup, which is a common app for applying to YC companies. So anyone can apply, and your resume gets sent to all the founders who are hiring for this particular role. Or we have, a Series A program that helps you as you like get ready to raise your Series A, and a growth program. So it's like, as YC kind of matures, I think we like more programs are created by our partners who are founders, who are like, this is what was missing when I was back in YC like 10 years ago.
That's so cool. It sounds like YC is doing everything possible on earth to set everyone up for success and do their best. And so, jumping off of that, would you be able to share some success stories at YC and how their journey looked, and perhaps even maybe a failure story and what went wrong in that path?
Ooh, so success stories. It's really hard to choose one. But one of my favorites success stories, when I first started at YC, I met the founders of PlanGrid. It was a woman named Tracy, who used to be a construction engineer. And she used to have to carry these giant blueprints around construction sites. They were like 50 pounds. And she's like this like tiny person. And she would also get to a construction site, and they'd started building, but they were building on outdated blueprints. So she was like, there has to be, so it would be like a wing of a hospital had already been started, but they were using outdated blueprints that were, from a week ago. And she's like, there has to be a better way to do this. So they launched PlanGrid in, I believe it was 2012, 2013. And they wanted to put the world's blueprints in the cloud, so that anywhere, anyone who's working on a construction site, whether that's like the architect or the people on site, all were using the same blueprint. And of course, you don't have to carry physical paper blueprints. So it was really like incredible to see them grow, and to see sort of Tracy like grow into the role of CEO, and then go from like just her co-founders during YC, I think there were 4 of them, to hundreds of employees. And they ended up getting acquired for about close to $1 billion about like 2 years ago, or less than 2 years ago. And then now Tracy is a visiting partner at YC. And it's been really cool to kind of see her whole journey from like just starting something and like with a few co-founders to really getting pretty huge, and then now like kind of paying it forward and being part of like the YC like partner kind of network. So she's one of my favorite kind of success stories. And what I loved about her was she was solving her own problem. So she had, she was out there in the field as a construction engineer. She had this problem and she was like, this is a shitty process. Like, we need to figure out how to do this better. And she was, and you know, when you're solving your own problem, you kind of come at it, you know, with special insights, right? And also she knew her first customers, like she knew who she had to kind of sell to and build for, and she could get really great early feedback from her, you know, former colleagues. So that's what I loved about her. I would say, like, for many of the failures, it's like, and there are many, right? I think, but what's kind of cool about YC is, like, I think there's there's a stat that says like 70% of all venture-backed startups fail, but at YC so far, 70% of the companies we've ever funded are still alive, and many are thriving. I think there's like over 150 that are worth over 100 million, and 25 that are worth over a billion, but there are many failures. And I think when we see those happen, and I won't name any names, I won't call anyone out, but when I think when we see that happen, it's a few things. One is, one is like, you didn't end up making something people want, which is why, you know, YC's whole motto is make something people want. And it's like, just talk to as many customers as you can from early on and figure out, like, why are people using you? What do they like about you? What don't they like? Why are they churning? And really making fast changes based on that feedback. The second thing is seeing co-founder disputes. So that's a really hard one, because we see a lot of really promising sounding ideas, and like teams really just like fall apart because the co-founders like can't make it work. And a couple reasons. So a couple things that we look for in the application when we're trying to identify like whether a co-founding team, it's hard to call, but like when we're trying to figure that out, we look for even equity. So if you have two co-founders, as close to equal, like 50-50 as possible, even if one person came up with the idea and started working on it like 6 months earlier, like we don't want to see like a 90-10 split. We want to see like the two co-founders or three co-founders are in it for the long haul together, and they've had those conversations about equity and what it means to spend the next like 10 years of your life working together. The other thing we like to see is that the co-founders ideally have some sort of relationship beyond just like having met and wanting to start a startup. You'd be surprised. Like, sometimes we'll interview a team and like, we're like, oh, how did you guys meet? And they're like, we met at a bus stop 2 weeks ago. And then like, you know, I pitched him. I said I was getting an interview to YC, and he said he'd join me. And we're always like, oh no, we need to let that team bake a little bit. But, you know, so we like to see, like, have you done like, you know, previous work projects together, previous school projects together, or even side projects? Like, do you have some relationship so that when things get hard, you know that, you know, this team will try to work together because they want to sustain this relationship, even beyond just being co-founders. We look for, you know, so I think that's one important question we do ask in the application is like, what is something interesting that you guys have done together? And so, yeah, co-founder disputes is a big one. And then, yeah, so I think that those are the most common things. It's just like not working quickly enough with users to kind of iterate and pivot. And then the other is co-founder issues.
Yeah, it's so interesting that with like these huge startups, it's often like the more personal and detailed things that might lead to failures. And this is something that I think some of the students at Xoogler School have talked about. And going off of that discussion in your answer, what do you think is the role of the individual founders' personal, emotional well-being? And what is the role of that in the success of their startup?
Oh man, that's an important question. And one I think like isn't talked about enough is like the emotional and mental health and well-being of the founders. And, you know, a lot more of our founders now, I think 10 years ago, nobody talked about it. Now, in the past few years, a lot more founders are being really candid about their challenges. And so one thing that we try to, you know, we do, so during the batch, we have a woman that used to work at YC is now a founder coach. And she's a therapist and founder coach, and she works with co-founders through a lot of these issues. And does essentially like kind of like couples therapy with co-founders, to be honest. And we all talk about how it's normal for co-founders to fight and to disagree. All co-founders fight and disagree, and the founders of Airbnb have had, you know, fights and disagreements. But the important thing is like, how do you react to each other in those moments, and setting up a really good cadence of checking in with each other is important. And so I think, some of our best founders say, like, maybe at the beginning it's on a weekly basis, maybe as the company grows it's on a monthly basis, but the founders, kind of get together, check in with each other, not just about KPIs, not just about like metrics. They talk about like, how are you doing as a person? Like, what are, how are, really like figuring out, like, are we on the same page in terms of goals, and like being very candid about how things are going. And I think our best teams really pay attention to that, and make sure they have that ongoing communication with their co-founders. And because it is a really hard process. And that's one of the reasons why we recommend not starting a startup by yourself. Like, if you look at the top 100 YC companies, I think you'll only see maybe 3 or 3 to 5 that were built by solo founders. Like, it's still possible to build a big company that way, but it's so emotionally taxing that it just really helps to have another person, not just to split up the tasks, but to split up that emotional burden. And what we've kind of seen is like co-founders will balance each other out. So if one is having a really bad week, the other one will like kind of help pull the other one back up, and vice versa. So you'll never, hopefully aren't both like down at the same time. So it really helps to have someone really carry that emotional weight of building a company as well.
Alina, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a follow-up question here, since it's a very appropriate one. So Kat, we have these students who have other students they can meet within this program. They're all in all different universities all around the world. What's a good way to potentially find a co-founder within this group where they don't need to start a company next week or next month or 6 months, but maybe a couple of years time, right? But it's good to perhaps start finding people they may want to work with. What would you recommend the students do during this period of time?
Yeah, I think this is an incredible program for that specific, for this specific reason. So I think this program, and then just generally being in school, like, you will almost never again be surrounded by so many smart, ambitious people. And so you don't have to immediately start a company together. I'd say make friends, right? Get to know each other as people. If there are projects that you're interested in working together, or challenges you're both interested in solving, like, kind of start doing side projects and building for the sake of building, and talking about your ideas together, and really develop that relationship. Because I think this is like a great time to meet potential co-founders, to meet, potential people you might want to work with or hire even in the future. And some of the biggest companies in Silicon Valley grew really quickly because they hired friends earlier, or friends of friends, and that's sort of how the first 10 people show up at their company. And so this is an incredible group. So I'm excited that you have this opportunity, and it might not be, today or like a year from now, but like a couple years from now, it's like you might still be in contact and decide, like, now's the time. But yeah, I think it's definitely one of my favorite 2 women that started a company together. They met in 2015 at one of our female founder conferences, and one worked at Dropbox at the time, and the other was like, she was like an artist and designer. And they just kind of stayed in touch and talked about their ideas, and then they started building side projects, and then they launched a company called BioRender in 2017, and they've been like, they're one of our fastest growing companies. And like, I think it was great because they kind of created this like very organic relationship before they decided to jump in and go full time.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I'd definitely say that Xoogler School for me as a student has been a place where I can meet a lot of like-minded peers and create something that we all enjoy participating in. And I kind of wanted to bring the conversation to be grounded in what is also happening in the world right now. What do you think is the impact of just globally troubling times like a pandemic? And how does that impact entrepreneurship or innovation in general?
I think it's, if you look historically, if you look at 2008, 2009, after the last economic downturn, we saw that, some of the biggest companies today were started in that time. Sometimes it was, Airbnb started because the founders literally couldn't pay rent on their apartment and had to figure out some creative way to make enough money to pay rent. Or, so a ton of companies were built around then. and just had to be a little bit more creative and scrappy because they were probably doing it without any money or with very little money. And that's what we're kind of seeing today, is that we're seeing, I think the best founders or the best teams are just sort of having to be more creative about how they solve problems, and more creative about like, how do we launch something, and how do we get something like an MVP, something scrappy out into the world without a ton of investment. Um, One good thing I've seen so far is like the appetite from on the investor side at least hasn't decreased. Like we're seeing all of our startups get funded in, with as much capital as they were pre-pandemic. Like for a while it was sort of stalled like in the spring, because I think a lot of people were worried. But I think this is like an opportunity for a lot of people around the world to be creative. And like, unfortunately, a lot of people are also like out of work, they're losing their jobs. And it's like, if there's like, I think we'll see some things emerge out of that, because people have to just are forced to, be more creative and launch their own, their own companies or their own businesses. It is. And then what another thing I see is like, this time is opening up, like exposing a lot of problems in the world and exposing a lot of things that need to be fixed and need really smart people thinking about them and how to solve them. And so I think these concepts and these ideas are emerging, that were always important, but like are just now there's more light shown on them because of the times we're in. And so I think that what we're also seeing is just like a lot of smart people starting to turn toward more of these like big problems, and trying to figure out like, how do we like, focus our energy on this? How do we help with XYZ problems? And so I think we're also going to see a lot of like, I think it's become more clear now that we need like the world's, smartest, most ambitious, like young people working together on solving a lot of these problems. And so so that's what my hope is that we'll start to see a lot of like interesting, companies, nonprofits, just like problem solvers like out there.
Yeah, that's so cool to hear, because I think a lot of us students are also just people who were in college and are now trying to make the best of our gap years, and some of whom are actually entrepreneurs and trying to solve some problems that they have encountered throughout the pandemic. Which brings me to the Dory. We're going to open it up for everyone to ask ask their questions. And yeah, Rosie will take it from here with the Dory questions.
Yeah, so I put the link to the Dory in the chat. So if you haven't asked any questions, but you have some, please feel free to submit them. But I'm just going to get started. So this was an anonymous question, but I think Ben Gordon also asked a similar one. So what's the process like of applying to internships at Y Combinator when you're an undergrad?
Yeah, so we have a site called Work at a Startup, and it's here. I'm going to put the link in the chat. But Work at a Startup is a common application for YC companies, and even YC itself. And you basically just like fill out an application, and it goes to everyone who is hiring for a specific role. And so you, as the applicant, get inbound, and if those companies are interested. YC doesn't really have a traditional internship program for like YC as an organization itself, but we work with a bunch of our alumni companies. And so for example, we'll do events and we'll have dinners for all the interns working at YC companies. So we sort of kind of aggregate them all together and create kind of programming and dinners and events for the interns at YC alum. But yeah, I would recommend going to Work at a Startup and checking that out if you're interested.
Awesome. And a little bit as a follow-up, this is more of Ben Gordon's question, but he was wondering if YC encourages students to apply for their own startups, and how can students find a balance between running their own startup, whether it be YC backed or not, and focusing on their academics?
Yeah, so we definitely have funded a lot of students. We funded, I think the youngest person we've ever funded is a 15-year-old, and he had to have his like mom sign all the papers because he was not 18 yet. And then like, yeah, it was, so, I would say like, and then, across the entire age range, I think we've also funded people in their 70s. So it's like, it's a wide range of people that we fund. But what we say is like, if you're in school, for the vast majority of people, it's probably better or best to like stay in school and like, meet as many people as you can, because as I said, it's a super highly leveraged time to meet potential co-founders and potential people you want to work with eventually. We have had a couple founders start building while they were in school, and then apply, start like, I think there was one called Panorama Education where the founders said, oh, we spent like 60 hours a week working on this, and then as soon as they graduated, they applied to YC. I don't know that I would have been able to do that as a student. Like, that sounds crazy, like 60 hours plus your coursework plus everything. So I would say for the vast majority of people, just like use your time at school to find the problems that you're most interested in solving and start building projects around that and finding a team that you like working with. You don't necessarily have to like start a company or drop out. Sometimes you will start a company and it'll pull you out because it just starts growing so much, and it's just like, it's nuts, and like you have to make that decision then. But I would say for most people we talk to, I think it still makes sense to graduate and do that. I would also say will also say that we do sort of like an early admissions type thing. So for example, if you could apply now and be interviewed, in a couple weeks, and you can say like, this is what I want to do. This is the team that we have, but we don't want to do YC until after we graduate in the spring. And so we do give like early acceptances to some teams if we're like, and I think that helps a lot because sometimes people are like, I don't know, should I get a full-time job or should I, if you're sort of balancing a lot of different options, it's an option to apply early for YC. And sometimes we'll say like, you're a great team, you should come back and like apply for the summer if but it's definitely an option, and it doesn't hurt you if you apply more than once.
Rosie, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a follow-up question here. Kat, I'm learning so much from you about how to actually present on Zoom, so thank you so much for coming in for this. Can you talk about actually habits and also how the people, whether it's yourself or other people you've interacted with, but also perhaps younger founders you've seen up close, what habits do they have already? How do they learn? We always read about how the Collison brothers read so much, but what can people who are in the younger ages actually do and actually start learning and start developing themselves?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, there's so many resources online now. I mean, if you are trying to learn a specific technology or trying to even learn like the basic nuts and bolts of building a startup, like if you tried to do this like 10 years ago, there was like nothing online. So I think you guys are lucky because there's a lot of resources, and whether you're a visual or audio learner or you learn better by reading, it's like we have YC alone has Startup School, which is a lot of video and audio content. We have our YC ycombinator.com/library, which is all written content for the most part. And obviously a lot of different places online that have resources. So I would recommend, so for if startups are specifically of interest to you, looking through some of that material. But what's also important, I think, is finding a community of people that you like to sort of, if you're trying to set goals for yourself, right? If you're like, okay, I want to start building this, we have build sprints, for example. So the Startup School community is like, at one point there were 45,000 founders from around the world who were participating at once. And you get put into like weekly office hour groups so that you can kind of stay accountable to one another. And it's like an accountability team of other founders that you're working with. And all the resources are free, but you also have people who are going through the same process as you. And so I think that sometimes for some people, they're like autodidacts. They can learn on their own. They can build on their own. They can kind of do everything by themselves, which I think is awesome and great. Some people need that community to help around them, to help them get going and to help them keep going. And so I would say whether that's, Startup School or another or community like, the Xoogler community, or, we have, for women, we have Alpha, which is sort of like Reddit or Hacker News for women. If you need a community, there's lots of communities out there that can kind of help kickstart you. But yeah, I think there's a lot of great resources now online, and you just have to kind of figure out how do you learn best. And then I would also, there are now a lot of communities as well.
Yeah, awesome. And I definitely think I would love to get started with some of the resources, and I considered doing startup school at one point. So I think it's really an awesome opportunity. So our next question is from Levy, and he wants to know regarding diversity and inclusion, how diverse is the pool of applicants, and are there any YC initiatives YC is doing to support minorities and fund minority startups?
Yeah. So YC, we've talked to I can put this in the link as well. We put our stats out every batch about underrepresented founders, whether that's Black, Latinx, or women. And then now we recently also, we talked to our alumni recently about how our underrepresented founders who were already went through the program, and we asked, like, how can we better highlight, or, how can we better help you? And they all suggested that we kind of create a directory so that underrepresented founders can be more easily highlighted and found by potential customers, potential investors. And so we launched the directory a few months ago, and you can see, like, there's a link there for Black founded companies, Latinx founded companies, and women founded companies. You can kind of see through, like, a lot of those teams, and eventually we hope to, like, aggregate even more of their stories. And yeah, the pool of applicants is not as diverse as I would like, and that's something that we think about a lot. And we think about, how do we reach more underrepresented founders and encourage them to apply to YC, and even before they have started a company. And so one thing that we're doing is we're supporting two nonprofits. One is called Color Stack, and one is called CodePath, and they essentially was started by students, and what they're doing is they're creating communities of Black and Latinx and Indigenous like computer science students at, like, a lot of the top universities, and creating communities and helping them, connect them to resources and jobs and just, like, community overall. And so we're working, we're basically, helping fund those organizations, and then helping like provide resources. So, a bunch of my partners will do office hours with CodePath and Color Stack, teams or people, and talks with those organizations as well. So that's one thing that we're doing. And then another is our Future Founders Conference. So we're starting with, we have Future Founders Conference for women in November, but we're hoping to also do these conferences for other sort of underrepresented groups as well, to highlight those founders and their stories, and to help encourage, people to start companies from, all different backgrounds, and so those are a couple of the things that we're focused on in the near term, but we're also, like, I feel like this is a question that a lot of people are thinking about and working on, and if you guys have any suggestions, we're also always open to hearing them. And at universities beyond CodePath and Color Stack, who I think are great, also working with, HBCUs and Black student unions around on campuses around the country, and just trying to listen to students, and hearing what they want, what resources they want access to. So that's, yeah, our ongoing kind of work.
Yeah, that's incredible, and sound like some really great initiatives. So our next question's from Renee, and sort of generally, so she's specifically interested in the construction field, and she's interns there, and would love to meet Tracy because she has interest in software and using PlanGrid daily. So she wants to know how to reach out to her, and then kind of more generally, I think a lot of students are interested in different YC startups and different YC founders. So how would you recommend Xoogler students go about reaching out to them and getting involved in these startups?
So for Tracy, I can, if you send me an email, I'm kat@ycombinator.com. I can shoot Tracy a note, and if she's down to chat, then I'm happy to intro you. Or she's also right now a visiting partner at YC, and her email. I can also do a warm intro, but if you want to just, like, reach out to her cold, I'm just double checking that she's just Tracy@ycombinator.com. And I think you would be surprised by how helpful our alum are. It's like, I think you have a very good chance of, like, saying, like, I'm in Xoogler School, would love to chat with you, to, like, many of our alumni, and you have a good chance of getting a response. And so what I would recommend you doing is going to this directory and like looking through, like you can filter by industry. So say you're really interested in ed tech, and you see like there's a company doing, let me just pick a random one for like, there's something doing like online classes for kids, kindergarten to 5th grade. And you're like, I'm really interested in like, what does a future of education look like, especially remote education? And there's a bunch of like companies listed in the ed tech space, and you can see who the founders are. And, they often have their Twitter or LinkedIn, and I would say just like shoot them a note on Twitter, or if they have their email, like shoot them an email, and I think you'll be surprised by how many people will respond. And there's also, if you're looking for jobs, there's open jobs like on this random page. It says like Zip School is hiring, full stack engineer and an iOS engineer. And especially if anything looks interesting to you on that end, that's always an option to say like, I'm really interested in this. And like, yeah, I would say later stage founders, like if you look at like the YC top companies list, like probably the top like 10 are going to be hard. It's going to be hard to get like, Patrick Collison, chatting for very long, but you never know. So I would say like, just reach out and just follow up and see. And then, but I think like for the vast majority of people, YC alum, I think, they're always happy to hear from like, talented young people, and they'll probably try to hire you. So like if you don't want to work for their company, just remember, be careful of that. But
yeah, awesome. So then our next question is kind of jumping back into the actual application cycle. So this question comes from Lauren. And what have some of the strongest applications you've read had in common, or what are the best traits that you've seen from founders?
Yeah, so I think it's on the point of being clear and concise. I think, we really believe that if founders have thought deeply about a problem, they can explain it in less words. They can, and explain it very simply in a way that anyone can understand. So I think it's like that, like the best applications. It's funny, we went back and read applications from like some of our top companies, and they're always really well written. And they're always they're short and concise and very clear about like, here's the problem, here's how we're solving it, this is who we're solving it for. And so I think that's like the number one trend that we see across all the best applications, is that they're very like clear and concise. I think then it's also, I think some of them have a good balance of like, here's what we're doing today, and this is our main focus, but like, I think there's a question later on in the app that's like, how big could this get? And it's like the founders have an ambitious dream for what they're building. So they're like, we're starting here, but we really think it could get to be this big. Like, that's kind of exciting to see like a balance of that. And I think we see like a lot of the information about like teams, like how they met, what they built before, together and independently as founders or as people. And then I think there's a funny thing, like, I think there's like what's the most sort of impressive thing that you've built or achieved, or what are you proud of? And people have like really creative answers to that. And it's like, or what's your best non-computer hack, which is really a question about like, how have you like cleverly solved a problem, right? Or what's something that you've like, when you've had to like go around a system and solved a problem, like what have you done? And there were some really interesting responses to that. And so I think, those are and it's funny because like, I think if you talk to any partner at YC, we'll all have slightly different answers about like the way we read the application. But at YC, it's like at least, 2 or 3 partners are reading all the applications. So it's like, we all have slightly different visions of like what we find interesting. So yeah, it's a question that you could ask, I think, any of us and get different answers.
Awesome. That's a really, like, I love watching clever hacks. I think that's one of my favorite things to think about. So it's pretty cool that that's part of the application too. My next question is, if I don't get chosen from YC, will there be an explanation as to why? And do you also categorize the startups?
Yeah, so I would say if you apply and don't get an interview, I would say you don't get an explanation of why, because we get 15,000 applications, but um, about 50% of the companies we fund today have applied more than once. So we always tell people, like, even if you don't get accepted this time, you should definitely apply another time, because I think it's like your chances of getting an interview like go up if we see over the course of the last 6 months you guys have been really moving quickly, and sort of we have at least 2 data points that show us like how that you're still together as a team, what you're kind of focusing your energy on. So I would definitely say apply again. If you get to an interview stage and you get a 10-minute interview, you will get an email that day that talks about like here's what we think you need to work on. And it doesn't mean like we'll never fund you, but it says, but often what will happen is we'll interview teams, we'll send them that email, and then they'll apply again next batch, and they'll say like, hey, we addressed these issues that you called out last interview. And when we see that happen, we're like, oh my god, this is amazing, like, we need to call them back in and talk to them again. So I would definitely say that it's definitely worth applying more than once, and you will get a response if you get to interview stage.
Awesome. So those are all the questions we have on the dory, and we're kind of running out of time. So I think that's a pretty good place to end. I'm just gonna say thank you one more time. This has probably been the most engaging hour I've ever spent on Zoom. So thank you so much for that. But I'm gonna pass it back off to Chris.
Oh, thank you, Rosie. And Kat, this is such an incredible time. Thank you for giving up your hour. I know you're in the middle of interviewing all the different YC applicants for the winter class, but students, I'm sure you can tell why we invited Kat in. What a great speaker, but also the resources she shared. If you're trying to figure out what to do between now and the next time you're going to in-person classes or online classes again, go look through Y Combinator. It had hours and hours of amazing content, the best speakers, the best instructors that you can prepare yourself for the rest of your lives. Really, really awesome. And Kat, any last words for us as we sort of depart?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And if you guys ever have any questions about YC or generally, feel free to shoot me a note. I might be a little slow to respond right now since we are in the middle of application reading and interviews, but I will get to you eventually. And that's my email. I just put it in the chat, and you are very welcome to reach out.
Thank you again, and good luck with the incoming class. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Alina. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks for the great questions. Bye.